Jai Bhim and welcome everyone to the third webinar in the Academic Freedom in India series coordinated by INSAF India, International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India. My name is Lotika Singha and I'm Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Wolverhampton. I will be co-moderating this webinar with my colleague Arun Asokan. Arun is a postdoctoral fellow under the chair of History and Philosophy at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. History and Philosophy of Mathematics. We are both members of INSAF India, and we are a group of diasporic Indians located in different parts of the world, currently mainly in Europe and North America. We are academics, professionals, we are anyone generally deeply concerned, upset, worried, and anxious about the increasing assaults on academic freedom in India, in particular attacks on anti-caste academics, researchers, scholars, artists, and activists. We consider it our obligation and our responsibility to raise our voices to direct international attention, not only to what is happening in India in terms of infringements on academic freedom and anti-caste research and activism, but also to the growing dissemination of anti-intellectual, regressive, casteized political thought in the name of Indian culture and history across educational and research institutions all around the world. We believe that academic freedom is inextricably linked to social justice, and that knowledge production and formation are bound to the fostering of our social selves. Along with INSAF India, this webinar is co-hosted, and I thank our co-hosts by Ambedkar King Study Circle, California, Scholars at Risk, the British Association for South Asian Studies, the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis, University of Amsterdam, the Forum of Education in Asia, University College London, and the Southern Illinois University Honors Program. Before I introduce our three guest discussants, I just have one housekeeping point to mention that we look forward to your questions, but please post them in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Thank you. And as I said, I'm very pleased to introduce our three guest discussants, and thank you all very much for again accepting our invitation and being with us here today. Anjali Arondikar is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies and founding co-director, Center of South Asian Studies, University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research engages the poetics and politics of sexuality, caste, and historiography with a focus on Indian Ocean studies and South Asia. She is the author of For the Record on Sexuality and the Colonial Archive in India, winner of the Modern Language Association 2010 Alan Bray Memorial Book Award for Best Book in Lesbian, Gay, or Queer Studies in Literature and Cultural Studies. Her second book, Abundance, Sexuality, Historiography, and Geopolitics, grows out of her interest in the figurations of sexuality, caste, and capital in colonial British and Portuguese India. Dhonta Prashant is a research scholar at School of Economics, University of Hyderabad. Dhonta's research interests include agricultural economics, development economics, economics of caste and discrimination, and economic history. He works on contemplating caste in changing economic relations, in particular to its relevance in the context of land, labor, and the course of economic development. He was president of Ambedkar Students Association for 2014-2015 and an elected Students' Union president of University of Hyderabad for 2011-2012. Uma Chakravarti is a feminist historian who has written extensively on caste and gender, so I'm not able to list anything here, but I'm sure many of us are familiar with her work. And Uma is also a filmmaker who makes films on women who have gone to jail for their political work, including Fragments of a Past. I will now hand over to my co-moderator, Arun, who will first set the scene as to why anti-caste research and activism. Over to you, Arun.
Thank you, Radhika. We think that we need to delineate what is caste and what are the deep structures of caste before we pondering on anti-caste and anti-caste scholarship. Let me start from Ambedkar's enigmatic pronunciation. He said that turning any direction you like, caste is the monster that cross your path. There is a recurrent attempt from individual to cross the path of caste. That time, we can see that there is a monster that's stopping individual mobility against caste. Monster means a being which haunt us. But Ambedkar, it is a deep structure. It is a structure of 4 relations which fix one's identity in a society hierarchically. It is anchored on reproductive relation. As we know, caste is decided by birth. If one born in a scavenger family, he become a scavenger caste. He become a scavenger caste. So a member of a scavenger caste. That means the anatomic system is defining his identity, and it makes impossible a casteless birth of an individual. This, by fixing his identity inside a structure of caste, it denying 3 other possibilities of liberation that is available in a democratic society. First one, freedom to choose a labor that are available outside in a caste system to liberate himself. Its second one, it denies the possession of landed properties and other symbolic properties to do a dignified life or lead a dignified life. Third, it denies one's participation in a network of relation which connect an individual with other individuals and institutions. So by fixing the reproductive relation, by fixing one's identity in a caste, it denying the productive relation, property relation, and network of relation. That means if one born as a scavenger or born in a scavenger family, he forced to do socially the scavenging job. In that way, it denying the possibility to choose another job. For us, the productive relation means division of laborers, as Ambedkar said. It is rather than division of labor. As I said before, here property relation also fixed by in the line of caste. It fixed in a hierarchical order. So caste is a deep structure that fixes one's identity immobile by fixing its location by these 4 deep structures. So being an anti-caste individual or being an anti-caste intellectual, he making a possibility from all the impossibilities which fixed by this system. So it is a very difficult job. It is a dangerous job. So an anti-caste activism perhaps attempt to critically uncover these technologies and the operation of the system. So from this context, I would like to ask a question, or we would like to ask a question by asking you all to talk about what we mean by anti-caste scholarship and anti-caste activism. How can we understand absence of caste as an analytical category in Indian social analysis? And what have been the consequence of this in terms of our understanding of Indian society, its social, political, and economic dynamics? In particular, the reproduction of hegemonic social relation of Indian society. Would you reflect on this?
Yeah.
I'm inviting Danta present.
Thank you, Dr. Arun, for inviting me to this panel today, which would talk on criminalization of academic space, in particular reference to the anti-caste research being curbed in the academic spaces in the country, in India particularly. And I also would like to thank INSAF for having me on this panel. It's in fact a matter of no privilege to be part of such a distinguished panel, to be here. Well, to start with anti-caste research as such, when we see anti-caste research is a product of anti-caste struggles, right? And these anti-caste struggles were aimed to achieve equality in social sphere as against an unequal social order, which treats caste Hindus. Caste Hindus is a term that has been coined by Dr. Ambedkar, referring to the twice-born Dvija caste. And so these anti-caste struggles are aimed to achieve equality in social sphere as against an unequal social order which treats caste Hindus with reverence while breeding contempt, hatred against Dalits. And Dalits are basically the former untouchable caste, and we can also, it's also part of the Shudra and Atishudra broad structure. And these anti-caste movements aspire to challenge the educational and economic inequalities that are built through an organized and ordained structure, which has been ordained through the scriptures of Manusmriti and as well as many scriptures of the Brahminical literature. Through this ordained structure of socio-economic order, aim to retain access to education and wealth while monopolizing access to education and wealth to caste Hindus alone, while denying the due share that needs to be accorded to Dalits in both economic and educational sphere. Anti-caste movements have in fact challenged these notions of monopolization. Ayyankali's movement, for example, is leading an agrarian strike, the strike of laborers, in order to get right to public education, is one of the phenomenal movements that must have ever happened, because they had to sacrifice their own food, their own work, their own labor in order to get access to this education, which had been monopolized by caste Hindu society to twice born alone. Right? As caste has monopolized the structures of governance and political leadership to caste Hindus alone, anti-caste movements continue to work towards the democratization of the institutions and political leadership. By political leadership, I mean to say it starts from village to municipalities, to state legislatures, to central parliaments. We could see that these political leaderships also have been regulated even till date. Village panchayats, even despite having these reserved electorates, we still have the control of these village panchayats being vested with dominant caste. So thus, that it against such a monopolization, against such preponderance of dominance over the structures of governance, over this education, over these economic opportunities, anti-caste movements have always had demonstrated against such forms of exclusion. Now, this contestation between caste and anti-caste wasn't something new. It has been there in existence since a long time. However, what happened with regard to caste was that it had machinated through the aid of state and through the support of state and its propagandist machinery, right? So through that, it could suppress the anti-caste movements, but yet, as a phoenix raises, the anti-caste movements have time and again rose. We could see that with the onslaught on Buddhist literature that had come, and later on, which went on to Bhakti movements, and later on to Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, Ambedkar, Ayangali, and so on and so forth. And these movements still continue to inspire, and still, despite so many assaults, so many massacres, the Dalit movement for annihilation of caste still continues. Well, when we look at caste in such intricate manner, we could observe a pattern of its absence in Indian social analysis, in Indian social sciences, for that matter, in policy making bodies as well. Well, for this, the Brahminical academia had conveniently framed, it isn't that it hasn't framed theories on caste. It had framed theories on caste, but it has framed caste as a mutually acceptive institution, which by suppressing the anti-caste narratives, by suppressing the anti-caste struggles. Now, caste as an analytical category in Indian social analysis at large neglected the writings of Phule, Ambedkar, Lakshmi Narasu, Ayodhidas, and so many other important leaders who have written vastly about caste and who had discerned caste from other social systems across the world by distinguishing how caste is different from other social institutions. The major focus on caste, for the most part, was relied on the narratives of agraharas of the villages, with a hesitation to analyze the perspectives of velivadas. By velivadas, I mean the Dalit ghettos that exist in the villages, the paracheris, the cheris of the villages. So where the agrara-centric academia has basically neglected the narratives of velivadas. Thus, caste, which is a quite visible feature of Indian villages, was made invisible with its camouflagation under a conceptualization of class as a category. Now, while we agree to the existence of the categories of poor across all categories of caste, their location in the structure of caste and its network differentiates their access to utilities, services of both public and private. When we go to a village and compare an economically impoverished family of a dominant caste household vis-a-vis compare an economically impoverished family of a Dalit section, there is a push factor that happens in the case of Dalits, where Dalits will be pushed into a state of destitution. Now, despite having same capabilities in terms of accessing economic opportunities, but Dalits are being pushed into a state of destitution, while we could see a pull factor operating in the case of a dominant caste impoverished policy through the networks that they have, both in state, in village, through the networks of caste. So thus caste becomes an enabling feature for the dominant caste, whereas caste becomes a depressing feature for Dalits. Now that's to basically avoid discussion on caste. was in place in Indian social analysis. No, Arun, do you want me to kind of?
Yeah. Thank you, Prashant. Now let us. Uh, uh, can you, Anjali? Can you reflect on this?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Jai Bhim, everybody. And a big salam to all my comrades who are here with me on this panel. And of course, those of us who are joining us from many different places. I'm going to read a little bit, but also talk a little bit and hopefully not go on for too long. My comments on this question of anti-caste that Donta has so wonderfully laid out for us vis-a-vis his own research comes from my own work on histories of sexual labor, sexuality, and caste, and specifically from my own experience as a person who belongs to a Devadasi Kalavant family, and also someone who works on those issues. So my intellectual labor is very much part and parcel of an effect of my lived life and connections. So one of the foundational challenges for me in doing anti-caste thinking, and this may go a little bit against the grain of what we are trying to do here, is that it has posed for me a challenge of how to think the embodied complexity of caste as triated, pliable, and fixed. That is, the persistent unverifiability of who counts as a caste subject, whether it is through the OBC category, which is, as we know, relentlessly pliable, ESBC, STC, and so on. So there is that unverifiability, pliability, which is in fact the part of the embodied complexity of caste, alongside the rights and judicial model of caste in the language of rights and representation that requires us to identify as Bahujan, Dalit, etc., within the sort of same discourse of caste and sexual violence that created our difference to begin with. In other words, we know caste is an effect of systematic state, Brahminical class, and gendered power. Yet, ironically, we are summoned to identify with the very categories that have created our minoritization to begin with. So that's the paradox and the challenge for me in doing anti-caste work, particularly because I think about sexuality and embodiment. Now, any robust anti-caste scholarship and activism, in my mind, requires a balancing act between these true translations of caste, one more fluid and the other sedimented in the language of the state, both uniquely pressed upon by languages of oppression. For me, such a balancing act has meant that I have now returned to the concept of what I will call Andolan imaginary, of the term Bahujan, a term that was used as a rallying call in the early 20th century to bring together the Bahu, the majority of lower caste subjects, under the umbrella of unifying liberatory vision, marked importantly both by conflict and collaboration. I mention this because the term Bahujan today is primarily attached to electoral politics, to the establishment of Bahujan-based parties, to the history of leaders such as Kanchiram, such that the diversity and fury of organization and resistance that the term originally coined has fallen away. So for example, in Maharashtra, where I work, in the early 1920s, the term Bahujan was the rallying call used by many communities precisely to bring together Devadasis, Adivasis, Dalit, etc. So the term has now morphed to a very instrumentalized term, and I want to go back and think about its Andolan imaginary, the possibility that that term can give us to move out of this paradox that I began with. For me, an embrace of the multiple Bahujan Andolan imaginaries is as central to anti-caste scholarship so that we are able to see beyond the blazing popularity of a very masculinist Chandrasekhar Azad to the less known yet equally inspiring actions of Bahujan women, trans, queer subjects like Hidme Markam, who was recently arrested in Dantewada region in Chhattisgarh on the very day that Adivasi women were protesting the death of their kin in police custody. This, of course, happened ironically on International Women's Day, when the Chhattisgarh police were talking about how vigilant they were against crimes against women. Now, Markam's story as an Adivasi activist is as central to me as the story of Chandrasekhar Azad and my Bhima-Koregaon kin, because her work as an Adivasi women's rights activist, land right activist, environmental and mining, anti-mining activist, and most importantly, founder of the Jail Bandi Rihai Manch, a group fighting for prison abolition and prisoners' rights, allows me to imagine a more radical and feminist caste imaginary. Of equal importance to my Bahujan anti-caste scholarship and activism is the work of trans Dalit activists such as Sneha Kale, a trans candidate for the 2019 Mumbai parliamentary elections who stood and lost, but rallied for her trans community of Bahujan laborers and ran, most importantly, on an open platform of sexual labor and recognition. Thinking through the Bahujan Andolan imaginary also allows me to speak of the work of someone who is not very popular in anti-caste work, that of Dayanand Bandorkar, a lower caste capitalist and the first head of state of liberated Goa, who does not fit our prescription of anti-caste politics and more. Yet for me, to do anti-caste scholarship is to embrace the messy diversions and incarnations of all of these Bahujan forms and work with their complex versions of caste, gender, and sexuality. I'll stop there and turn it over to my comrade Uma.
Thank you.
We can't hear you, Uma.
Yeah. No, I didn't unmute us. Well, it looks like I'm the oldest person over here and one who's taught in a university for God knows how long. I taught for 40 years. So I go over a history of, let's say, how the university did or did not address caste in terms of scholarship. And also, the crises that came and perhaps the activism that was forced upon university spaces because of the struggles outside. So let me just begin with the fact that as an analyst, one of the issues flagged is that caste as an analytical category. Why was it not used? Is it an analytical category at all? And I would say that depends actually, depended. And I'm dividing my reactions to a point where caste was forced upon the public sphere by militant struggles of Dalits and Bahujans to address caste. So, and I think that the crisis came when questions of reservation, and especially of reservation and expansion of the issues that would perhaps transform the university were faced. So I would look at scholarship that predates this moment of crisis and scholarship that comes afterwards. And there is a decided break. Older scholars it's not that they didn't, they wouldn't deal with caste, but that they would deal with caste in the classic sociology courses. It did not exist. One hardly knew of it in places like even the history departments, although history departments should actually have engaged with caste. And in a sense, the university system, progressive university system, was overlaid by the phenomenon of trying to understand class. So because that was the thrust, let's say, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, courses were framed around issues of, those were the dominant paradigms in social sciences. And it was, and in a sense, this will take us back to the problem of the left and its inability to engage with caste. Its refusal to engage with caste, let's put it like that. Donta is here and he's from Hyderabad University. From the 70s, actually, Andhra, Hyderabad has been a center. I mean, Osmania, later. And there were left movements, very radical left movements. But one of the issues that they did not actually confront was caste. And we know that from now writing that has come out and so on. They took a long while to include gender, but they also basically subsumed caste under class. That has been the dominant problem as far as social science thinking in India is concerned. It was subsumed under, without even explicating what is the relationship between caste and class in terms of access to productive resources. So in a sense, I think there's a tunnel vision that the left showed, and that actually dominated even progressive social science research. But then there were also departments like sociology and so on, which were stuck with a very consensus model of caste. It was filled with caste. I mean, Delhi University, for instance, the sociology department did nothing but caste up until Mandal. But when Mandal came on the scene, then they dropped caste like a hot potato. And they said, it is something that we are being forced into. And then, in a sense, Mandal was the crisis moment as far as Delhi University was concerned. But I would say in various ways, I think universities were forced to then confront. And so the forwards, backwards, the intellectual, the point around who leads in argument and who leads in social science research is definitely a upper caste, primarily Brahmin, but other castes. And this goes back historically to the access to English education. Access to English education has really been very skewed and loaded. And there were struggles which we don't know about. And people like Phule not only defined the Bahujan, but also defined hegemonic knowledge and were critical. I mean, for me, the most powerful idea that Phule has given is the concept of the third eye, the Tritiya Ratna, which is the eye that can see beyond what the normalized see, this is the eye here, the analytical eye, which has to be open for you to understand social relations. So his writing, whether it's Tritiya Ratna or Gulamgiri, it's infused by an understanding of a non-Brahmanical mode of arguing and thinking, which is very powerful and which we actually ignored. So I think we used to, refer to Paulo Freire or this one or that one, but we actually had thinking here which confronted this mode of capturing and sustaining the hegemony of the Brahman or the Brahmanical, the perpetuators of Brahmanical knowledge. Now that reflected back in the universities. So the universities are actually, forced, historically, did not acknowledge the deep, inequality that caste perpetrated on society. But also, hardly anyone wrote, and you certainly did not bring caste, class, and gender into their thinking, which is actually the quantum leap that is made ultimately with, not by the sociologists, but to some extent by feminist scholarship. And I would put a large number of people in that, which includes, Gail Omwet and a number of people. And it is Maharashtra which leads in that, in that kind of conceptualization. So I would say that there is an acknowledgement of caste, but not as an analytical category, not as a category that explains social relations and the deep structures of inequality, and certainly bringing caste and gender together. Caste, gender, and one should expand it to include class, is not something that existed historically. And I think that move has been very important in struggles and in understanding our own location today in how we view our society and what the sources of knowledge are for understanding our society, which is actually transformative in some ways. I'll talk about the fact that I'll end with saying that the university did not completely disbar discussions of caste, but it was skewed in a certain kind of way. And as I said, the Mandal moment was very powerful. The Department of Sociology in Delhi University actually produced a white paper at the time of Mandal, and said we can't have this because we are now a modern society. We have to move in the direction of scientific achievements, of nuclear power on the one hand, and medical research of AIDS. This is how they actually framed the issue of caste and reservations and so on. But let's also consider that, and I think that's something we should always keep in mind, caste as reservations has always been an element in the university system. And so it's not absent. It's there, hidden, and it comes out from time to time. So in a sense, I'll stick with that, those comments for the first round.
Thank you. Yeah, we are here. The inner eye. That concept is very much profound because one cannot see the embodied capital, embodied properties of caste in his own body. So it is not a matter of eye, it is a matter of mind. We need to think seriously to understand that. Let me invite Lohit to ask another question.
Yeah, thank you, Arun, and thank you everybody for really starting us off so brilliantly, and Arun for bringing out that one point. And I'm going to go back to what Dhonta mentioned towards the end of his contribution there about you were talking about the Agraharas and the Velivadas, and also I'm going to come back to that now actually. But I'll start with Uma this time, and So Uma, in the absence of the caste question, are Indian universities functioning as agraharas, do you think, which, as we know, were grants of lands and incomes given to Brahmins by elites for the purpose of building and maintaining temples or pilgrim sites, as well as for residences of Brahmins and their families to live in? So does the predominance of hegemonic caste people or bodies in the university make them sort of modern agraharas?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't think there's a study on this, but I think there should be, and it really should be done because if you look at the history of universities, they are definitely agraharas. And I want to say that the agraharas actually as a concept is very powerful because I have heard it being repeated in things like old age homes and so on. It's a little agraharam. I am very comfortable over there because it's a little agraharam. So this idea that you have these Brahminical enclaves everywhere. If we take it today, even from the point of view of retirement homes and work backwards, you find that the universities were definitely historically. There was historically a monopoly of knowledge in the hands of the Brahmins and an exclusion of other castes because everyone was supposed to do their own respective work, and knowledge of thinking, conceptualizing was actually something that was a prerogative of the Brahmin. So it's not surprising that Shambhuka has to be killed by Rama when he's sitting and doing penance, because penance will give him extraordinary powers, to be able to dismantle the hegemonic knowledge. That's really what Shambhuka is doing. I mean, that society values penance. He's sitting there and doing penance. And the story is amazing that a Brahmin boy is brought, a dead Brahmin boy at the age of 15 is brought to Rama's door. And he's told that there is unearth happening in the country. Wrong is happening in the country. And Rama gets up and decides that he's got to go and search for it. So he goes out looking for Anarth, and he goes and finds Shambhuka sitting and meditating. And he asks Shambhuka, who are you and what are you doing? And he says, I am Shambhuka, I am in Shudra, and I am doing tapasya. That's enough. And Rama just cuts off his head. And he cuts off head. Please notice that's the seat of thinking. He cuts it off. And that is the moment that happens, the Brahmin boy who has died revives. Because now knowledge will return, quote unquote knowledge, returns to the Brahmin, the monopoly of knowledge returns to the Brahmin. This is the mindset. This is the way in which understanding your society and being able to deal with it is conceptualized in the mythology. And I'm not surprised, therefore, that, the first, and the struggles over access to education in the 19th century, which are documented, and it's interesting that the government schools is where the Brahmins often go. Phule actually goes to a missionary school. He didn't go to a government school because the facilities of formal education provided by the British, the English education that will make you clerks, is actually being provided to highly skewed population, which is basically the upper caste. And if you do Maharashtra, Anjali, I'm sure will bear me out, it's literally the monopoly. 94% of the students in university with higher education are from the uppermost caste, which includes basically Chitpavan Brahmins, some sections of the Chandraseni, CKPs. So at the end of the day, everybody else is excluded from that knowledge, historically. These are the people who have actually come into the university and taken over completely. You look at the IITs. I mean, if you do a caste-based analysis of the IITs, you will see exactly what is meant. So that the universities are the guard. They are the fortresses of guarded also, whether they will say so or not, is very much in the hands of, it reflects the caste system and the exclusion of knowledge of, and including why have there had to be such prominent struggles to get into the university. And you look at the IITs are among the most important locations for the critique of the caste question. So it's the Ambedkar societies in many of these universities that have actually interrogated the unequal manner in which the upper castes and primarily, Brahmins and others, the educated, the Bhadralok, have completely taken over the university system. So I think in that sense, the university reflects the historic biases of a society which have excluded knowledge to sections of the people. And while women are being let in now, the fear of castes, Dalit groups and other caste groups bringing their own politics into and their own understanding over into the university spaces is something that is deeply feared and resisted also in whatever ways. That's why the IIT Madras, for instance, banned the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle and so on. So these are reflections. And University of Hyderabad, Donta's here, he will give us a graphic account of what happened in the University of Hyderabad, and how state power was used to actually crush the struggle of for scholarships. What is scholarships actually? It's access to education. It's access to being able to sustain yourself in an unequal system. Yeah, I'll leave it now to.
Thank you, Huma. That was again really great start to this question. I'll come to you, Dhonta, now. Exactly, I think that to follow on, just adding another layer to that question is what are the challenges faced by anti-caste student movements in this agraharam? So I'm just adding that on to what we already asked Oma. It'd be great to, yeah, if you could talk there. I'd also like, there was a question in the chat by the audience actually. Can you explain the difference between Dalit and Bahujan, and is one preferred one over another in anti-caste work? Is one more politically correct? So I was just thinking if you could just clarify that before you answer the question. Thank you.
No, probably can I take this question at the end, because I just want to join the conversation on the university spaces and all. Can I take it in the end?
Yeah.
All right. No, I just want to start a comparative account. No, one is both come from my own experiences. One is of a village level experience of a study that I have been carrying, and then one is of a university level experience, right? In a village where there was one big major landlord who was controlling all land of the village. No, that particular landlord under whom there were paleris. Paleris were basically permanently attached laborers, and they had to depend upon him because he is the sole owner of the land, right? So this paleru one day decided to have his own way of life, to start grazing of livestock, and he wanted to graze livestock by getting a few goats and sheep. Uh, as and when he starts grazing, and apparently there's a village forest that is there in that common in that particular village adjacent to which there's a common village forest. Now he goes on to graze, and for nobody there comes an objection, but he gets an objection that no, how are you grazing? Why are you grazing your sheep and goat over here? And the forest officials take him off from there, and then they penalize him. Now, the background story for this penalization is the contact that this particular landlord has with this forest official. And the reason for getting that laborer penalized is precisely because he does not want this laborer to get free and get free from the clutches of caste-based labor. Now, from that point to university space, when we come here, the university, as we see its administrative apparatus in Indian universities consists of academic councils, executive councils, where now, despite Constitution of India mandating the Reservations in Admissions Act, we could see that it's been clearly floated, and these academic councils, which comprise of majority of Brahminical faculty, they by themselves rule out these clauses of reservation, right? By having meaningless cutoffs, which basically cuts off the entry of the marginalized sections itself into the university spaces. Now, that's the starting point of the conflict that gets arisen in the universities, because the access to education itself was a long-standing struggle that millions of Dalits had to undergo. In fact, many of Dalits had to sacrifice their lives in order to get this access to education. Now, once, even after entering even after getting these rights enshrined in Constitution, enshrined through several acts, despite that, Dalits will have to constantly go through a process of struggle. And despite that struggle, the administration, through its legal apparatus of academic council and executive council, rules out. So thus, as a landlord uses the state, it uses its legal mechanism. And whenever there's a protest, for example, our own case, I just want to mention and then leave it out. What happened with regard to the anti-caste movement that was happening at University of Hyderabad, right? And just because we were speaking about Ambedkar, just because we were speaking about our rights to implement reservation, to make sure that our entry is guarded, and to make sure that all social welfare schemes are implemented, there was an assault that unprecedented. I would not say unprecedented, because these assaults have been happening in many universities, in many spaces. Probably they might not have reported. In our case, it has been reported because Rohit Vemala was institutionally murdered, and that becomes a triggering point for media to talk about caste. Otherwise, nobody would even care to talk about caste. It takes a death of a Dalit to talk about the kind of psychopathic behavior of caste. It takes the brutal rape of Manisha Valmiki to highlight the gruesomeness of caste. And otherwise, nobody reports about these incidents of caste. So thus, there was a struggle that was happening on the lines of thoughts of Dr. Bhima-Koregaon, which is propagating his ideals. And look at what happened. There was an onslaught on one independent student organization named Ambedkar Students Association, from the university level administrative apparatus to the central government apparatus, because the fundamental ideological structuring of this onslaught is aimed to prevent access of education to these students who are coming from these laboring masses. They don't, they want this servility to continue. They don't want this servility to end. They want this caste-based forms of exclusion to continue. Hence, university still continues to remain as a tipping point of agraharas. They haven't lost that character of agraharas.
Thank you so much. That was, yes, there's a comment in the chat box about some saying that they really like your analogy of the university with the feudal system in the countryside. So I just thought I'd mention that before. Anjali, yes, would you like to come in?
Thank you. I would add another analogy, one that my father used quite a bit, was he described the university as a devasthan, basically as a kind of temple ground which segregated and surveyed who allowed us to enter. So I think it's a good way to think about caste capitalism and the university form, and how Brahmanism through religious doctrine undergirds the continued consolidation of this form. I'm thinking very specifically, and this goes to Donta's comment about who is let in and who is let out, is if we try to connect, for example, why it is important for those of us who work within universities to think about a relationship between the Kisan Andolan and the current crisis around reservations. Everyone here in the audience knows about the recent debacle of the IITs and IIMs saying that pushing back against the reservation quota, saying we don't have enough candidates, this is stymieing our growth, etc. But also that the Kisan Andolan's refusal of the agrarian reforms has to do with the refusal of privatization. So the refusal of reservations is about a different genre of privatization of universities, right? So the IIM, IITs, etc., elite universities use the language of development and growth to speak to why reservations is not allowing them to move forward. And it is the same mantra that the Modi government is using to think about agrarian reforms that they're pushing for. So I think it's important for us to think about caste capitalism as very central to the ways in which we are thinking about the university. Now, the second thing, and this is where, like Uma, I am a feminist historian, I want to insist that we also remember that these questions are not of Modi's making. These caste has been a relentless force of segregation, especially for gendered bodies, for a very, very long time. So even as we express solidarity for people like PNB, Pranab Mehta, who everyone is writing about, and his resignation from Ashoka University, let us also remember people like Kumud Mahade, the first Dalit Mahar woman who was a trained Sanskritist who was denied a job in any center of educational learning in Maharashtra, and was only able to become at the end the chair of the Sanskrit department at the government college in Amravati, because she married an anti-caste, upper caste activist with the surname Pawade. So I think it's important for us to remember that the university has segregated different people, and even as we rally around the despotism and authoritarian of the Modi regime, we need to remember that these are repetitions that are familiar and continue, particularly in terms of systems of education. I'll stop there because I know we have a lot of questions, and we'll say more in the next round.
Thank you very much. Arun, can you add to that and go to the next?
I think that nationalism, economy, and class are dominant analytical category for analyzing Indian society and extend to gender studies. How and why has caste become an undervalued category of analysis in Indian gender studies, labor studies, and political studies? What are the challenges faced by scholars, both teachers and students, to address question of caste in all these domains? Can you reflect on this, Anjali? Can you reflect on this?
Sure, thank you. What I would like to do here is sort of invite us to move away from the language of value. So instead of saying, why is caste undervalued? What happens if we move away from this discussion of value and utility and think about the radicality and stubborn refusal of anti-caste scholarship to conform to our understanding of what is valuable within university knowledges? Now, I've spent a lifetime studying histories of caste and sexuality, not to bring them to the center of our analysis, but rather to say that the questions we ask must demand that the pursuit of knowledge be produced and radically changed through different paradigms of interrogation, right? So I'm not interested in inclusion and representation. I think those are lost causes. What I'm interested in asking everyone here is, what does anti-caste scholarship allow us to think? What does it allow us to bring to the table in the ways in which Brahminical or Savarna, whatever word you want to use, does not allow us to do? So I think it's important for us to move outside of the language of value, because value becomes about utility, and utility becomes about a certain Brahminical, as I've said, caste capitalism, which I am not committed to. Specifically because I write about sexual labor. Sexual labor falls out of the value chain, and it is important for us to think about how to center it without decentering other values, right? So this is really, really important. And I think, again, to insist on the work of feminist, Dalit, Bahujan activists who have repeatedly invited us to embrace a kind of radical paradigm of thinking. Now, there are many ways in which one can think about this. And one way to think about it is to move outside of these paradigms of vulnerability, paucity, and loss, which are rampant and ever present and are an ordinary fabric of every lower caste person's lives. But what are other ways in which anti-caste scholars, and I'm going to mention a few, because one of the things that I'm really committed to doing is pointing to the efflorescence of writing, scholarship, thinking that is being done, particularly by anti-caste scholars who are Bahujan variously defined. And I'm going to mention a few so that that will give you avenues to think about caste not as undervalued, but caste as efflorescent, abundant, and a place of radical possibility. So let me give you some examples. And these examples I have picked particularly because they are narratives of sexual pleasure, peril, possibility, sexual violence, and yet provide us with enormous futurities that we can aspire to. So one very famous work for many of you here is, of course, B.A. Santram's early 20th century treatises on contraception, conjugal rights, to Bama, who is much more well-known. A recent book, for example, Sangati, which talks about the history of sexual violence within Dalit women's lives, but refuses to surrender to that as the determining form, or Viramma's magnificent biography, which speaks to her rage and refusal of such histories. And of course, my personal favorite, the Marathi poet Jyoti Lanjewar, who wrote radically about the sexual and gendered politics of education, revolution, and caste. So I want to end less with this imaginary of undervaluation, over-evaluation, but speak instead to the kind of abundance of caste, anti-caste thinking that is there if only we are to look for it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I quickly reframe this to Uma. Here, Anjali clearly point out that the value of the categories are important for an analysis. So I'm asking, I would like to ask that why the recurrent presence of the categories of nationalism and class are very much prevalent in academic analysis. Why, rather than the absence of caste, why this overpresence Can you delete it or can you elaborate it?
Yeah, well, to start with, it is the preoccupation of the bloody Bhadralok. It's that damn Bhadralok which actually decides what is intellectually stimulating. And here I will implicate the American academia, for instance, into American particularly, but first world scholarship, which actually begins and ends with Partha Chatterjee, I mean, like whether it's a nationalist resolution of the gender question or whatever. It's like such a, and that is the thing that travels. That is the thing that actually is picked up and treated as it's the entry point to understanding India, not caste, not a more radical way of thinking about it. So it's this inner outer, it's the poor Bhadralok of man's crisis that he's colonized in the public sphere. So what does he have? He's only got the power over his wife. And so they resolve the nationalist question by the inner outer. Now, this kind of bilge, I call it bilge, it's literally bilge, is actually what's dominating academia. And it does not allow you, and I would like to go back, I mean, having stated very strongly my objection to, it is the Bhadralok that set the agenda, and it closed discussions, and or at least it didn't close discussions, but it led it in a peculiarly skewed way. So Donta's analysis, for instance, I want to go there because I have a point to add to him. Now his conceptualization is coming from he's looking at the landlord and the landlord's control over labor and the Dalit laborer with the kind of intellectual property, the monopoly of the intellectual, so-called intellectual classes on the leadership of ideology, or thinking. So obviously they come with things like nationalism, which in any case is post-colonial studies is the biggest market as of now. I keep saying the British came and went, they went away forever. What is this? Why are we stuck with, going on thinking about nationalism and the violation of the indigenous modes of thinking? None of them mention Jyotiba Phule. So if you actually think from the ground, you'll get a completely different analysis, And I wanted to say this when Donta ended. You look at the crisis currently in, you go from the university to the field back again. One of the reasons why there's so much sexual violence against Dalit women is because Dalit women are going to school now. Dalit women they're actually accessing education and seeking to transform their own lives. They will no longer be available to work on the field or provide sexual labor, to the free sexual labor there's a crisis in places like Haryana. A woman who complains about rape has to be siphoned away and hidden in a place because all the caste class forces come to try and prevent her from being able to ultimately get legal remedy for the violence. So if you look at the relationship between what's happening in the world outside and what's happening in the academia, you will actually see why. I mean, it's completely irrelevant. The class is not irrelevant, but nationalism, to my mind, is completely irrelevant. And class, if it does not understand the relationship between class and caste, is completely irrelevant. So I don't understand, why we can do economics and we can completely ignore caste over there. So this is the way in which we have stifled and stymied approaches that come from thing. And there I would agree with Anjali. The powerful writing that's come from Dalit men and Dalit women has actually interrogated this. Who the hell cares? I mean, Gogu Shamla, when she's writing and when she's writing about sexual, the sexual use of Dalit girls, is writing very powerfully from her own historical experience. So there is a whole way in which there is a knowledge system and a conceptualization and a speaking to people, which is being done through literature. if it doesn't come in social sciences, it's their loss. It's coming through literature, through the writings of people organically from the ground, you know.
Thank you. Danda, can you reflect why, as a student of economics, why the category of caste is undervalued, and what are the challenges you face to bring the question of caste in your analysis?
Yeah. Arun, when I again want to take back the question to one discussion happened in Indian economic thought, particularly on agrarian tenures and the tenural forms of sharecropping or fixed rent form of tenures that were existing. So basically, Marxists have viewed that the shifting away from sharecropping to fixed rent as a form of agricultural tenure is in fact moving away from pre-capitalist forms of economic exploitation to the capitalist mode. Whereas there's another discourse that was prevalent was that sharecropping as an institution had basically promoted a more durable sort of a network, or more durable sort of a framework between the landlord and the sharecropper, as landlord would facilitate credit. Hence, sharecropping should be deemed as a better institution, comparatively a better institution in the times of crisis in agriculture. Now, these twin frameworks basically excludes caste as a category. Because even by switching over from the sharecropping as an institution to fixed rent form, you don't have transfer of land that has happened that has happened from the dominant caste towards the lower caste. Hence, the tenant remains to be the same, landlord remains to be the same, but the question only gets twisted in these forms of because basically this is what Marx has explained, and that's what is being applied to Indian context very bluntly. And at the same time, this discourse on sharecropping apparently comes from a person who also has come from a landlord family. I don't want to take the name of that scholar. He's a scholar of a well reputation. Now, here the question of objectivity also comes in, because sharecropping as an institution has also been viewed as an institution with sexual exploitative tendencies, where dominant castes exercise their for land to sexually exploit the Dalit laboring classes and to harass the Dalit laboring classes. So this angle never comes, because for that scholar, these things might not even matter. So thus the question of objectivity itself gets ruled out in these particular analysis. Whereas for a Dalit scholar who's trying to engage through field studies, for example, in India, if a Dalit scholar goes out to a field visit, the immediate next question that a scholar would confront is from which social location you come from. Mtolo. That's the question that Mtolo means. Who are you? To which caste do you belong? You locate that same question to somebody who's from the dominant caste locality. Imagine the kind of narratives that that person might extrapolate from the field as compared with the Dalit. So, and how that dominant caste person might use it in terms of theorizing the narratives that would fit into the frame of these dominant caste localities. So thus, these are both challenges as well as, I think, probably in a sense, both narratives should come in so that we can have an argument over how this dominant caste perceptions would matter out as against the reality of the system.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're coming to. This has been an amazingly rich discussion, hasn't it, Arun?
Yeah.
We could go on for a long time, I think, but we're conscious of time. We know we're coming to our last question technically. I also think, Arun, that the two questions that are posed at the moment, which are left in the chat box, the difference between Dalit and Bahujan, I think some of our audience may not know that, I would like to know more about it. And also the question on where do Lingayats stand today? Can you throw some light on anti-caste movements and them with respect to Gauri Lankesh and Kulburgi? Could be covered with our last question, isn't it? As we talk about criminalization, it will get covered in that.
I think so.
And I think Pallavi Rao's question, as Dhonta has spoken about his about economics and land, some of it I think is covered, but Dhonta, if you want to speak more about that later, then when you come in, we can leave space for that in the end, if that's okay. So the last question, and Dhonta, actually I was going to come back to you again first now, is given all that we've talked, what do you think has made scholars, both teachers and students, who've been raising the question of caste, who work against the caste system and become criminals in the eyes of this modified state as we have right now? And of course, in that we can include Gauri Lankesh and all as well. Thank you.
Yeah, basically the anti-caste movements that have been happening on campus or outside, there has been criminalization of these anti-caste movements. Now, the precursor for these criminalization is the emancipatory tendencies that these movements have in the amongst the depressed classes, particularly because there was this term called Edicalam, which is the times of ignorance, wherein people could be fooled, wherein their land titles could be snatched away by the Patels and Patwaris. Patels and Patwaris are basically the governing structures of village in terms of land rights. Now, when there's a transformation from this Edicalam to times of emancipation, you will not be able to immediately snatch away these the rights that one would possess, right? So there is a desperate attempt in present context, and this attempt has been an ongoing process to basically push those who are coming into these emancipatory movements to a stage of ignorance. The recent attack on Dr. R.S. Praveen Kumar, who's heading the social welfare education institutions in Telangana. So they have been, that's a public educational institution. They have been doing marvels by basically speaking about the icons who have talked about equality, who have talked about justice, and Dr. Ambedkar, Phule, all these icons have been brought into the they've been trained from school level to basically talk about these principles of equality and justice. They've been taught not to treat themselves as inferior. They've been taught to dream high. Now, this process was basically undigestible for the dominant caste. Hence, you could see political heavyweights coming and attacking these institutions. Now, for Dr. Ambedkar's oaths, for Dr. Ambedkar's speeches to be reiterated in public spaces has itself become a crime. Country in the eyes of these casteist forces, right? Where if Dr. Ambedkar had to say, I was born a Hindu, but I wish I would not die a Hindu, right? It has had a deeper meaning that under this framework, when somebody is not being even treated as a human being, what is left for me to even survive in this framework? So this thought of emancipatory potential, that is what these casteist forces are afraid of, and hence there's an attack that has been happening, and that's what has happened basically with Rohit Vemula. That's why he had to write that powerful writing that the value of a man has been reduced to his immediate identity, and that all our lives we have to struggle all our life, and we will be pushed back to that stages of ignorance. So there's a need for, I mean these struggles have been are not new, and these struggles have been happening from a long time, and these struggles must go on.
Thank you, Dhonta, and yes, for reminding us of Rohit's words, which I think cannot always, just bring so much sadness, and so sorry for that. Uma, sorry, Uma, I'll come to you last, actually. Actually, yeah, can I come to you next on the same question?
Yes, I think Uma should have the last word. I would sort of add to what Donta is saying is that this question of criminalization of anti-caste scholarship is also very much a regional issue in India right now. I mean, for example, I'm thinking about Maharashtra, the region that I know and work and live in, is that because of the rise of the Shiv Sena, for example, not the rise, I would say the continued hegemony of the Shiv Sena in a place like Mumbai, and the continuous demand of the Marathas to be included in reservations to a larger capacity, and the Marathas, who are themselves, of course, the oppressors of other lower caste communities, the question of criminalization of what is caste has become very messy. So that's number one. Number two is that as someone who works on caste and histories of sexuality, I also have to train young scholars and find them ways to continue to do that work. So one of the things that we are having to do is sort of guerrilla anti-caste work in some ways. In a place like Maharashtra, you can do work on sexuality, you can do work on sodomy, you can do work on trans rights, but you cannot do work on caste, property, subject nexus, or the histories of Kharid Patra, bills of sale, that are part of so much of the histories of Dalit and Bahujan lives. So I think one of the challenges right now is also to think about what is the authoritarian state allowing research on, and what is it not allowing on, and how minoritized subjects are now being placed in competitive relationships to each other, right? So for example, if any of you have followed the debates around the pride marches, etc., to say queer azadi and bring in the question of Kashmir is not allowed at a pride march. Neither is it allowed to say Jai Bhim, because sexuality is not supposed to be about all of those questions. So I think when we think about criminalization, we also have to remember that it must be in solidarity with a lot of other radical minoritizations that are being made to do the work of the state, not in their name. We need to refuse those kinds of imaginations as well. And this is, of course, a strategy that the state of Israel uses against Palestine all the time, right? So this is a well-known strategy that authoritarian states use, that they pit these forms of identification against each other. And I think it's very important to signal what is being allowed, what is not being criminalized, who in whose name, and how that obscures those histories as well. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Uma.
I'll try and do a sort of, for me, this is the heart of the issue we are confronting, which is the criminalization, because what we are witnessing is this assault by the state on any independent mode of thinking. And I do want to return back to Hyderabad for it, because I think this crisis begins with the Rohit Vimala, the institutional murder, and the manner in which the students responded to that, primarily Dalit Ambedkarite students, but also some sections of the, let's say, progressive student body allied with it, and picking up people and putting them in jail. And one can't forget the visuals of people being put into the vans and taken off when they were protesting and so on. This actually assault by the state, and the fear of a radical Dalit, and in that sense Dalit Bahujan thinking, and a radical coming together to some extent of a radical, somewhat Marxist, I don't know how to frame it, but a radical left mobilization. And I think Bhima-Koregaon, it really brings that very powerfully. There's panic at the idea that there can be a radicalization of, let's say, the political ideology and thinking today, which can challenge Hindutva, which can challenge also the statist state with its exploitation, bring in also, for instance, Soni Sori and Chhattisgarh and Hidme and so on. There is if you look at the crisis in India, it's about social relations. It's about invasion of particular forms of capital into certain areas, which will mean the the ejection of large sections of the Adivasis into the labor force, into a cheap labor force that they'll go off because they will have lost their land. So in a sense, the caste question and the Adivasi question are very closely tied. So in there, I think the SC/ST categorization is interesting because the anxiety is about these two large segments of the population who are not automatically invested in Hindutva and its ideological assault. They have to, I mean, this is the crisis. The state, to turn numbers, to actually have consent for their rule, which they have got from the upper castes very clearly. Is it going to come to them from these other segments is the critical question. Because their own social relations and their own exploitation in this scenario is not easy to paper over completely. Then there will be struggles. There will be struggles for land, for labor, for rights, for the legislation of different kinds and so on. So I think that crisis moment is being understood, and the assault and the criminalization and the incarceration is coming to try and terrorize the population to comply, because we hold state power. So in the ultimate analysis, whatever you might say, whether the university functions or doesn't function, we will kill the university on the one hand, and we will also incarcerate you and ensure that you cannot even engage in the public sphere as far as your thinking is concerned. So I see this as a critical moment from the point of view of trying to look at how what is happening, which is deeply implicated in the social relations, and it's deeply implicated in the caste and Adivasi question. And I'll give you an example, and maybe it will lead you with an interesting, there's a real fear of the radicalization of the Dalits. To some extent, they think that the Adivasis are, may be going in that direction also, but the radical Dalit is something that they are quite anxious about. And so it's not only the university you need to control, but also other things. And I want to give you an example. A young man who, not a young man anymore, who's doing research on the Bhakti movement. Okay. He's in an independent institution. He used the category, two things that he was charged with and was not given us an extension. One was that he used the word Dalit for describing people whom let's say the broad, we know what Dalit means from the Dalit Panthers onwards, but so the contestation and the insistence in public sphere, in discussions you'll see when there are these debates happening, the BJP Dalit MPs often will not use the word Dalit. They will say SC. Don't use the word Dalit, they say use SC, because the power of Dalit in terms of terminology is something that they want to deny. So historic category of constitutional category, SC, and stop at that. So he actually, this man was not given his extension because he used Dalits as the term Dalit. And and then of course the other thing was that, our knowledge is, we don't need this colonial knowledge. You are coming back, you're coming to us with colonial categories, and colonial caste itself is a colonial category. So there is a thrust, there is an agenda. And that agenda, on the one hand, is intellectual and thinking, and the other is actually control over social relations in the world outside. So I see this as one reason why people need to be, and you have to terrorize people. By putting them in jail, you're terrorizing them to be in terms of thinking and what they can do and what they can say. So why is the university in the eye of the storm today? It is because that's where the thinking happens. And it's not even it's not a unified reaction, because there are so many groups within the university and they don't agree with each other. But the very fact that you can think and rethink and reconceptualize is the fear that they have. It doesn't exist only in the university, it exists all over, but that's the fear. So at the end, ultimately it's a carceral state, because that's the ultimate thing they can do to you. When they cannot hold you with the pliable WhatsApp universities and all the rest of it that they do, then this is the ultimate thing. Put them in jail and hope that they'll all shut up and they will stop, raising questions. So in that sense, it's a very momentous moment in our history, I think.
Thank you, Uma. Arun, would you like to, I mean, in a way, what Uma was saying about social relations goes back to what you were saying about the three, four, you split them down into reproductive and economic and the land ownership and all that, isn't it? So we've come back to the start, I feel, in a way. I'd like to hand over to you for your comments, and then we have 2-3 questions left. One for Dhonta on his research, and one is for Uma on patriarchy of Bahujan. So can I leave you to look at bring those in?
Yeah.
You plus please ask this. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll do that, and then would you like to summarize after that in the end? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
So we'll go a little bit over time, but I think let's people ask, most people still are with us, so let's do these. Is that all right? Yeah. So Dhonta, there was a question for you. Shall I read it out, or have you noticed?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, yes, you can read it out.
Okay, thank you so much for your wonderful observations. I was very, this is by Pallavi Rao. I was very struck by your concept of caste scholarship as presenting caste as history of a mutually acceptable phenomenon, as opposed to anti-caste histories where Dalit Bahujan movements have always presented it as a resistive history. Could you elaborate on this a little more? How can an anti-caste framework treat caste sociologically and in other disciplines? I would also like to ask about your own research economics and studying land and productivity through the lens of caste. Could you speak?
Yeah, no, basically caste as a mutually acceptive institution, I think we have seen Dumos speaking about it, and also we have seen how Gadgil and Guha postulate this framework as caste as something which is used in the sense of as a prudent conservator of natural resources in the manner in which it has developed itself into an elaborate framework where each caste has its own task. So as Arun has pointed it out initially itself, that caste is not a division of labor, but it is a division of laborers with no disposition to perform even that task, the task that one is supposed to perform. So there's hatred even to perform the task. That's why that you have seen Nara Maveshi Andolan in Uttar Pradesh, where Dalits have given the slogan to end these caste-based occupations, and there have been movements that have happened basically to end caste-based occupations. So that's how anti-caste movements have opposed this idea of positing caste as a mutually acceptive institution, and that basically comes from an agraristic view, is what I have mentioned in the beginning. So I mean, coming to my research on land, labor, and caste, and historicizing it in terms of agrarian productivity is concerned, I with the way in which the resources, agrarian resources, particularly irrigation tanks, have, as David Moss also has observed, that have served the purpose of standing at the center of symbols of power, such as the power structures of caste. So in that sense, I mean, I engage with my field observations in particularly 2 villages where I have gone and surveyed canvassed the entire village, and I could find that there are huge disparities, and these 2 villages also have been selected on the parameters of having highest scheduled caste proportion of households. And imagine if there's such a skewed distribution in terms of ownership of land in villages that have highest proportion of scheduled caste households, what could be the scenario in other spaces? And there it also have found that the most of the irrigated lands are, majority of the irrigated lands are still under the control of the dominant caste. So I do not argue that there's a continuation of what and how there's a continuation of an economic order of the past. I also argue that there's a structural transformation that has taken place, but this structural transformation also is resulting in an unequal socio-economic order. Precisely because the dominant caste had access to land, they could move out of agriculture through the by exploiting the laboring classes, and they could invest this exploited surplus in non-agrarian activities. So thus they have created an uneconomic order. And even if now we look at the kind of movement that Dalits are having, they're not having a movement from the agricultural laborer to the university spaces of teaching fields, or you don't see that kind of a movement to basically software jobs or into the jobs of engineering and so on and so forth. Their movement from agricultural labor to the fields of construction, mining, and labor activities. So that does this non-farm labor is occupied by predominantly these Dalit masses. So thus, despite though there's a structural transformation that has happened, this structural transformation also has its caste impression. So I mean, that's how I'm my thesis, my work is I've formulated. I've also engaged with this idea of perpetuity of property rights through the framework of Mitakshara. Mitakshara is one one property rights framework that was there since the times of Manusmriti. So through Mitakshara basically ordains that somebody who's born out of an inter-caste marriage cannot get inheritance to the family-based property. Thus, endogamy combined with this property of Mitakshara has basically limited the ownership rights to segmented groups. Thus, we could see a preponderance of wealth accumulation in the hands of few as against destitution of a vast majority.
Thank you. That was really good. I was asked some question. What was that? You have to remind me.
Yeah, so there's one question is, for you from Suraj T. How do we handle a question of patriarchy within Bahujans? Is it a folly to fall into the trap by Brahminical academia where we know how vulnerable those men are in a structure of caste? And I think that this part we haven't yet talked is that where do Lingayats stand today? If you could take both of those.
Okay, I'll take that. Well, actually, this debate around the category terminology is important. And a friend of mine, a Dalit feminist friend of mine, she said, don't use Dalit patriarchy, say patriarchy amongst the Dalits. Now, I think that's a clarification that she's making, because it's not me. And I suppose the mode of, if you look at the axis of gender, the mode of exercising power is definitely differential in different communities and castes. And to that extent, Ailaya's somewhat glorification of the Bahujan groups having their own, less oppressive, that the Brahmin woman is the most oppressed, and then down the line, the patriarchy gets more muted. Whether we agree with it or not, I think it is important for us to try and understand how gender, the power of gender works in different communities, and what is permitted and what is not permitted, and all of that stuff. So perhaps we need to do some research on that. But there is a universal characteristic also about the power of men over women, and that is the right to use violence, or not to right, but the arrogation of the manner in which you exercise violence and so on. So, and questions of masculinity and how they are inverted and so on. There's now some research is also coming out, on other communities and how they are articulating their own masculinity within certain spheres. I think it's a field which can be studied and be understood better from the point of view. And this, on the Lingayat question, I think it's a very important question. And this is an issue that I've had to think about. See, one of the things that we all do in a simplistic way is to say Bhakti movement was radical and it critiqued caste, interrogated caste. Actually, there were many strands in Bhakti, and some critique caste and some did not actually critique caste. I mean, they were, and the best example we get is of Chokhamela, who actually dies. He gets access to the temple, but he dies performing his caste-based labor, which is actually to work with earth, and the wall falls on him, and that's how he dies. So in a sense, you may get democratic access to God, you don't get transformation of the social relations. So in a sense, one needs to understand, how caste continues to operate through all of these ideological movements. And I think the Lingayats are a classic example because they begin radically, and they both on gender and on caste, they are fairly radical. And then the way in which the Lingayats have become a community of their own, and they are seeing themselves historically in a certain location, and refusing to actually see the radical potential that may have been there in whether it is Akka Mahadevi or Basavanna, is classic. And I would say Kalburgi's murder is the last of the things that happens to a man who actually writes on the Lingayats and what they've become. So 2 points that he raised, which are very interesting. He said, he pointed out that Basavanna's sister made a cross-caste marriage. She married a Dalit. Okay, and he put that in his research. And there was another piece that he said, some of the poetry of his wife suggests that she was sexually frustrated. And so, sexually unsatisfied, let's put it, not frustrated. Now, on these counts, this was based on his own research. The university, the attack on him was that his book was withdrawn. He was not able to continue with it. And so the Lingayats are now guarding their community, and the old history of radicalism is completely thrown overboard. So we may, as feminists, celebrate Akka Mahadevi, but nobody's going to now look at Akka Mahadevi as a radical woman who threw off her clothes and marched. So you see the difficulties, and that is because the Lingayats have continued to occupy a certain place in the social relations. So, the ideology cannot actually transform social relations.
Thank you.
That's the crisis that we are faced with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that is the deadlock.
Arun, before I hand over to you to just finish, Anjali, could you quickly just clarify the Dalit Bahujan, because you brought it in first, actually, the term, and somebody asked that time only.
That's true.
Yeah. Would you mind just quickly?
I think there's no straightforward answer, and I think that's the good thing. Is so the term, and as I think Uma pointed out, there are constitutional categories and then categories of emancipation. So Dalit can be a category of emancipation or a category of oppression, depending on who has the narrative authority to use it. I brought up Bahujan because I have been trying to think about a conceptual framework within which to think about multiple caste imaginaries while keeping central the political realities of today, where what is recognized as Bahujan is a form of caste oppression, right? So if you look at Maharashtra, for example, as I said, the new oppressors are the Marathas, right? So the idea of Bahujan has an electoral implication in terms of the Bahujan parties that are emerging, but it also has a historical implication, which is much more capacious and inclusive and complicated and conflictual. So I think, the fact that we don't agree, I think none of us here would agree on what we mean by Dalit, which I think is a good thing. And I would also insist on the term heteropatriarchy. I think it's very important here to talk about the fact that Dalit studies, Bahujan studies is still resolutely masculinist and heteropatriarchal in many ways. And we have to acknowledge the limits of our own scholarship and the limits of what we need to do as we move forward. So I would sort of end on a note of cautious optimism.
Thank you so much. Arun, over to you.
Yeah, this no. By listening the words of our friends, I think that we need to see what is crime in front of our modified state. Crime is not a crime actually, because there is a normativized law of caste is functioning our society, that is structuring us and locating us to be in a very, very unfree life of unfreedom. So the thing is that the people who jailed by the current regime, most of them act against the deep structures of relation, which I point out earlier. That means either they reacted to the reproductive system, or they reacted to the protection relation, or they trying to bring the democratization of property relation, or they sometimes bring to democratize the network of relation. That means if you take the case of Hani, he worked against the anti-reservation policies and trying to of the state, and he trying to bring this question to the public domain and engage in legal fight. It is an act against the production relation, division of labor, which fixed by the caste. Because in our universities, this production of relation is implementing very profoundly, because the knowledge production is denying the knowledge production of the Dalits or the other backward communities are completely denied by the systemic exclusion of this system. So here what we are seeing is that there is a normativized functioning and fixation of relation, and the act against the small act, it is a small act, have much power. That's the small act against these normativized tendencies is it is described and narrativized as a crime. So this small act is based on responsibilities, because most of the jailed public figures are act against the denial of right of the people. It is they are not claim their right. Merely they are not merely claim their right. They are bring the question of responsibility. So what I'm saying is that criminalization is an unethical act against the act of ethics, that the most of the people who bring the question of ethics and responsibility. So being an anti-caste is an ethical act, though the denial of that is very visible in our contemporaneity. That is the thing which we are seeing today, and we are fought against it at any cost. That is the point I need to say in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your ending to this absolutely enriching webinar. And I can only thank all of you, very, very grateful to all of you to have joined us today. And Arun, for your moderation of the seminar. Yes, Jai Bhim, and thank you. This was really, and this is being recorded. We will subtitle it and we will put it on YouTube, and people, it becomes an educational resource which we want people to come back to again and again. Before we end, I just want to give a little information about our next webinar, because this is part of a monthly series. And we will continue in some way from this webinar. We talked about Bhima-Koregaon and we talked about the jailed academics. And as we know, there are many anti-caste scholars and activists in jail at present. But amongst them is a group of 16 people who are called the BK16, where BK stands for Bhima-Koregaon. We don't have time to go into details here, but we are posting a link to a 5-minute video in the chat box, which has been produced by the poorest project. And this does tell you very succinctly and briefly, well explains the Bhima-Koregaon 16 case. And our next webinar on this will be on the last Saturday of April, which is 24th April. And we have titled it Ideas Behind Bars, something which we have talked about a lot about today, about the mind of people being what is the state is scared of. And so it's ideas behind bars through the lens of the Bhima-Koregaon case. And that webinar will explore how apparently different strategies of suppression come together as an ensemble to destabilize democratic structures and constrict public discourse, freedom of speech and dissent. The webinar will be moderated by a member of India Civil Watch's International UAPA group. And our discussants will include Professor Jenny Rowena and Professor Tarun Khaitan from, we will update on the rest of the panel shortly. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today, to the participants, and for staying on over time. But I think it was time that was well used. Jai Bhim, and good morning, good evening, or good night to wherever you are.
Jai Bhim, and do send us the link for the next one also, because I'd like to participate. I mean, I'd like to be in the audience for that.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's good to have met up. Don't I have meeting you virtually?
Yeah.
So good.
Thank you for meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you in person at the end of this crazy time. Be safe.
Sure.
Well, be safe and be well.
Very good. Jai Bhim, everybody.
Jai Bhim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.